Let's talk about Orson Welles. Visionary, maverick, magician, filmmaker, radio host.
This is Orson Welles.
These are just a few of the titles held by the one-time visionary Orson Welles, the man responsible for masterpieces of film like Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons, Lady from Shanghai, Touch of Evil, The Trial, Chimes at Midnight, F for Fake, and now, The Other Side of the Wind. For the Fox Valley Film Critics isn't the first time we've talked about an Orson Welles film. Our first episode was about Citizen Kane, which was the first in the lineup of the AFI's Top 100 American Films. But with the release of what many are calling Orson Welles' final film in November of this year, I felt as though a greater retrospective was necessary. The Other Side of the Wind is a film that was nearly half a century in the making, starting production in 1970 and only just finishing production earlier this year. I wanted to learn more about Orson Welles, and I knew exactly who to ask. So for this special episode of the Fox Valley Film Critics, this is The Other Side of the Wind, Orson Welles' last film. As with Orson Welles' seminal masterpiece, Citizen Kane, our story begins at the end of what is a much larger story. In order to understand this, though, we have to go back in time a few weeks. The day is Saturday, November 3rd, 2018, and today is the theatrical release of The Other Side of the Wind at the Music Box Theater on the north side of Chicago. In attendance, nearly a full theater with 500 people. This is the culmination of the story. Theatrical release one day after the premiere of the film on Netflix, alongside a pair of documentaries meant to talk about the history of the film, one by documentarian Morgan Nouvelle, and one by the production staff of the film to document the film's post-production process. This is the happy ending the story deserves. But in order to understand the history of Orson Welles, I took a trip much farther away than Chicago. The Fox Valley Film Critics is a show shot at FVTV Public Access at Waubonsee Community College in Sugar Grove, Illinois. Today, however, we're going to have to take a trip. Our destination? Woodstock, Illinois, the one-time home of Orson Welles. Though far off the beaten path, Woodstock has a very storied and proud history. In 1894, the city played home to UGV Debs during the Pullman labor strike in Chicago. The city has also played host to a number of major facets of film history, being the place where segments of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, as well as Groundhog's Day, were shot in large part. The town is very proud of these achievements. In recent years, it's taken on to another identity, being the spiritual home of Orson Welles. After being born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and living for several years in Chicago, the young Welles was moved to Woodstock, where he was enrolled at the Todd School for Boys at the age of 10. Welles also made his theatrical debut on the stage of the Woodstock Opera House in downtown. To start this retrospective on Orson Welles, I wanted to learn more about this history.
My name is Kathleen Spaltro. I am an editor and writer, currently working on Autobiography of Mary Astor, the actress. I've published many biographical articles and some books. And I also am an editor for a corporation in Chicago.
Tell us a little about the significance of Woodstock, Illinois to the life of Orson Welles.
Many years ago, approximately 10 years ago, I was reading Peter Bogdanovich's interviews with Welles that are collected in a book called This is Orson Welles, edited by Jonathon Rosenbaum. I'd gotten it from the Woodstock Public Library and sitting there reading, and Bogdanovich's interviews took place all over the world when he would join Welles, wherever he was. And he asked him all kinds of questions. It's a very thick book. But I was flabbergasted when I read the question and answer in which Bogdanovich asked Wells, who's the most important influence in your creativity? And Wells answered, and at the time Wells was middle-aged, Roger Hill of Todd's School for Boys in Woodstock. I think about him every day. I was just flabbergasted. I was thinking, I live in Woodstock. Why isn't this better known? So as I delved into the matter more and became involved with efforts to make this better-known relationship, Wells with Roger Hill as the headmaster of Todd's School, or Todd Seminary for Boys, and the importance of the school, its mission and approach to education. The more I realized that Todd's School and Woodstock are really central to Wells's emotional and creative development. They're not simply something that happened to him between 1926 and 1931. They are absolutely crucial, and as a member of Wells Nuts phrased it, Todd's School is where Wells became Wells.
So we're at the Woodstock Opera House. This was obviously a very important part of his life.
Well, he went to school in Todd's Seminary for Boys, which is east of here or was east of here, on what is now Seminary Avenue. And the school is gone. It was a very wide-ranging campus. But that's where the residential school for boys was that he attended from after his mother died, and just after his father died. His mother died in 1924, and he was sent to this school where his brother had been and been expelled from. And then in 1926, Wells was sent here, and he graduated at 16 in 1931. His father died in 1930. So the Hill family, and by that point Roger Hill had become the headmaster of Todd, became his family because he was effectively an orphan. Though he did have a legal guardian, his mother's probable lover, Dr. Bernstein, was his legal guardian. But he considered the Hills his family, and he came back here many times after graduation, and even after he became famous in the 40s, he brought his second wife back here, Rita Hayworth. So the Woodstock Opera House in and of itself was important to his career because he made his debut as an American theater director on this very stage in 1934.
What was the show he did?
What happened was he graduated in 1931, 16. I have to give a little bit of background to make this make sense. And he didn't want to go to college, so he talked his guardian, Dr. Bernstein, into letting him go to Ireland and do a walking and painting tour, meaning that he would paint a picture in exchange for his lodging for the night. And so there was a picture of him in a donkey cart going around Ireland with his painting materials. So he was touring around Ireland, and he got to Dublin, and there had been some publicity in the Chicago papers before this about the Gate Theatre and its innovative approach to stagecraft. So he approached the Gate Theatre actor managers and lied and said he was a professional actor. Remember, he was only 16 years old at this point. They didn't believe him, but they hired him anyway, because there was something very striking about him, particularly his voice, of course. But he was a big man, or big boy. He was only 16. He was a big young man, and he had an unusual quality. So they cast him in Gate Theatre productions in Dublin, so he made his debut as a professional actor at the Gate Theatre in Dublin. So after that, he tried to get work in Britain and New York, but was unsuccessful, and came back here because this was home. He was instrumental in managing a post-graduation production of Twelfth Night at Todd, and it was actually a film of that production. And then he was writing a play about John Brown called Marching Song. None of that went anywhere, though. So it was kind of frustrating. But then he had the idea of having a summer theater festival here in 1934 in the Woodstock Opera House. That there would be a theater summer school that Todd would sponsor. So he talked Roger Hill, the headmaster, his mentor, into this project. And with the support of Chicago society, because they had a lot of contacts among newspaper critics and so on, Wells' his father had been wealthy, and so he knew some important people. They managed to pull off a summer theater festival in the summer of '34. And he talked the Dublin actor managers at the gate to come here that summer from Dublin to be part of the productions. So what they did was do 4 plays in Woodstock that summer. On this stage, they did the play that Wells directed was Trilby. They also did Hamlet. He played Claudius, but he didn't direct that. And Czar Paul. Those were the 3 that occurred on this stage. And there was also a 4th play called The Drunkard, in which Charles O'Neill, Wine O'Neill's father, had made his name. And somehow he got pulled into doing that. But it's not clear to me whether that happened here or that happened on the top campus. But there were 4 productions that summer. So Woodstock Opera House is where he made his debut as a director when he directed Trilby, as a stage director. Also, that same summer, he directed his first film in Woodstock, which is called The Hearts of Age. It's a short film. It was just a lark. It was a fun project for a Sunday afternoon. So that is available online, actually. And then he and Roger Hill have been working for a while on a 4-volume project called Everybody's Shakespeare, which was published by the Todd Press in that year, '34. So all of these things happened in Woodstock in 1934. Now, before and after this, he had made some contacts which gave him the opportunity to tour with Kathleen Cornell with her theater troupe as a juvenile actor. So before the summer of '34 and after it, he was in Kathleen Cornell's theater troupe and was making his name as a theater actor. And so after he left Woodstock in '34 and went back to Cornell's troupe, he then made his way to New York and within 2 years did the famous Macbeth, and within 3 years did the famous Julius Caesar and made his name in radio. So he shot up like a meteor almost immediately, because he was only 19 in 1934. That answered your question?
It answered several questions. And so you were telling me you were largely responsible for bringing a lot of this back to light. What's it meant to Woodstock?
Well, my husband says I'm like a bulldog when I get something in my teeth. And I was just, as I said before, flabbergasted that this was not simply some incidental relationship, like somebody went to high school here, big deal. This was very important. And so what happened was, in 2013, we dedicated this stage to Orson Welles. And then in 2014, I managed a 80th anniversary of the Todd Theater Festival in 1934. It was a day-and-a-half festival that we did. And the next year was Wells' centenary, 100 years. He was 100 years old in 2015. So other people did a centenary observance in Woodstock that year. So yes, we started the ball rolling, and then eventually still other people got a sculpture done of him, which you will be filming later, which is right next to the Miller Theater. It's right next to Classic Cinemas, which includes the Miller Theater, which has been restored. I don't know if you're allowed to film inside of it.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, well, the Miller apparently has been restored to what it looked like in the 1920s. So the Todd boys would go to the Miller Theater to go to the movies. I think they should have the slogan, where Orson Welles went to the movies, for that theater.
It's been 70 years since Wells' youth. The city has grown, and so has his legacy. And now, 30 years after his death, we have this new film, The Other Side of the Wind, on our hands. Understanding the history of Welles is important, but it's time now to move forward and talk about the history of the film that now defines his late legacy.
My name is Josh Karp, and I am a journalist and author, and yeah, I write for a living. I produce television. I'm also a film producer. I'm a writer. I'm a screenwriter, and a journalist.
You published Orson Welles' last film in 2015. What attracted you to that story?
You know, I was writing another book at the time, and kind of in this period where you think, oh my God, I'm never going to finish this, and I needed a distraction. And I don't remember if I was reading a book about Welles or about John Huston, and I came upon 2 or 3 really great stories from the other side of the wind, and spent about a month sidetracking myself doing some research on it, because it just, every story I read about the making of the film was so extraordinary and so almost outlandish that I thought, you know, this is so much fun, and I started looking into it. And as I got deeper and deeper into it, I started to see that in addition to these fantastic stories, it was really the story of the greatest filmmaker who ever lived at the end of his career, trying to make this epic comeback film that begins to blur the lines between art and life.
Was this tied to the Indiegogo campaign, or did this just happen to coincide?
Absolutely happenstance. It was not at all tied to the Indiegogo campaign. The Indiegogo campaign, what happened was they, Philip Jan and his partners had acquired some rights to the film at the time, and were trying to raise money to get the film actually finished. And right around about 3 months before my book came out, Philip was on the cover of the New York Times, actually in the lab in Paris, where all this film had been stored for 30 years. And there was a picture of him, like, looking through some lens at the footage, and that was 3 months before my book came out. So it was good. I had great timing. You don't always get good timing. I had great timing there.
The moral of the story is it takes an act of God to finish this film. But
yeah, that is for sure.
Who and where did you end up turning to learn about the life of Orson Welles and all the stories involved in The Other Side of the Wind?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many sources, and they were so disparate. I began really with just what had been the assembled material. Joseph McBride, who has written 2 books about Welles and is a great Welles scholar, was of enormous help. His books were kind of an initial guide for what I did. But then, I just dug and dug and dug and had to establish, first of all, a timeline for what happened when, which was not easy, because this whole film was like the great Rashomon experience of everybody's life. Everybody was there, the things where there were only 8 people there, 100 people were there, theoretically. And everybody remembered it as being in 72 or 71 or 73. So I had to go back and, find back issues of Variety and The Hollywood Reporter and, various other sources. Then I did an enormous number of interviews. I'd say 70, 80, 100 interviews. And then wound up digging through both Welles's collected papers at University of Michigan, which were very helpful and helped me kind of figure out more of the where was he, when, and what was he doing at what time. And then Peter Bogdanovich's papers at University of Indiana. So it was this great, I'm not into putting together puzzles, but as professionally, that's kind of what I do. And so it was putting together this huge puzzle of what happened when and what it meant. So I had sources all over the place, that I had to pull together into one coherent pile.
So you were involved with Morgan Neville's documentary, You'll Love Me When I'm Dead. He's kind of been doing really well recently, because he did the Mr. Rogers documentary over the summer. He did that really great documentary about the Buckley-Vidal debates 2 years ago.
Yeah, Best of Enemies, sure.
Yes, he's really kind of becoming prominent as a documentarian. When did he approach you, and what was the experience of working with him like?
Well, so Morgan, I'm trying to remember exactly when Morgan approached me, but it was not long after the release of the book. I think Morgan had read an excerpt of my book in Vanity Fair that was sometime in spring of 2015. And then I believe he read the book and called me shortly afterwards and said, hey, I'm interested in doing a documentary about this. It took some time because he really wanted to be able to use the footage from the film, which was, despite the thing with Philip looking at it in the vault, took quite a while to get released. And there was all kinds of legal machinations and negotiation that took place before that happened. But once Netflix became involved, and Morgan had a relationship with Netflix, and they and Frank Marshall were instrumental in getting the footage released, then Morgan felt like, okay, we've got the footage from the film, we can do this. As far as working with him, it was an incredible experience. I mean, I got to co-produce the film, and I learned an enormous amount about filmmaking and about storytelling, and it was incredibly cool. I mean, I got to do a lot of the interviews and go back to people I'd spoken to before, but it's really an amazing experience to see something you did interpreted. I mean, Morgan did a lot of original stuff too, but it was kind of, you hear writers complain all the time about what happens when something they did gets made into a movie. And I have not only no complaints, I was thrilled because, watch you do something and then having somebody who's a real artist and who's really a great storyteller use that as the base to tell the story, the same story in a new way. I mean, you don't want to tell the same story exactly the same on film. And so that was fascinating. And being able to work with him, being able to work with the editors and see how the film was put together was just a wonderful experience. And he was, if I could work with him all the time, I would, because he's terrific.
Let's move on to talking about the history of the film a little. Orson Welles left Hollywood after Touch of Evil and returned in 1970. What facilitated that kind of anticlimactic return?
Well, what happened was, Welles left after Touch of Evil because that was really his last studio film. And he had a dispute with, I think, Universal over the final cut of Touch of Evil. And, he was always an artist first. And, in fact, that was really what mattered to him, always. And so they changed his final cut, and he wrote this 58-page memo to them telling them all the ways in which, they could kind of compromise and find a way to make his film that would be acceptable to them. And when that fell on deaf ears, he basically said, I'm done. I'm leaving Hollywood. I'm going to go to Europe and make films there. And he did. And for 12-ish years, he'd come back here and he'd work in films, but he wasn't directing over here. And he was making essentially independent films. I mean, he was one of the first real independent filmmakers. And he was putting together his own financing, writing, directing, starring in, he's doing John Huston once said he does everything except make the sandwiches. So Welles, became this really independent filmmaker. And what happened was, in the late 60s, there was this phenomenon called New Hollywood. And you had somebody like Dennis Hopper, who was perceived as a total mess, and like the biggest troublemaker, most unreliable person in Hollywood in 1967, right? And by 1969, he's directed Easy Rider, which is the most phenomenally successful, $400,000 investment, makes $70 million at the box office. And this is the point at which the studios, which have been crumbling already, realize we have no idea what we're doing. And Dennis Hopper, after one film, goes from idiot to genius. And the whole town really gets turned over to people who are young, who are not telling traditional stories, and who are making films in kind of this independent manner. Movies like Five Easy Pieces, Easy Rider, films such as that, The Last Picture Show by Peter Bogdanovich. Films that are nothing that a studio would have said, oh, that's going to be a big blockbuster. And these are the films that are making money. So Welles kind of looked at that and said, you know, here's this opportunity for me to come back and be a Hollywood filmmaker again, because these people are artists and they're not making traditional Hollywood movies, which is what he was never interested in the first place. And he kind of felt like, you know, hey, the soil is prepared for me to come back and, you know, be able to get funded by a Hollywood studio and become a Hollywood filmmaker again, but on my own terms.
So without giving people an excuse not to read your book, can you give us a basic rundown of the events of The Other Side of the Wind shoot?
Sure. So Wells started shooting in 1970, and the general idea was that he was going to shoot this film fairly quickly. But what wound up happening was he started financing it with his own money. He did have one opportunity to get studio financing that did not work out, that he kind of tried to take advantage of one of the studio programs that was funding young directors. And even though Wells was 55, you know, he was within that group, right, of these artists. And these were people who admired and respected him. But he had this incident where they looked like they were going to do it, and he didn't want to abide by any constraints that they wanted to put on him or play the game at all. And so he started shooting with his own money. And he had a very tricky relationship with money. He was a guy with enormous earning power. I mean, I think he was getting paid, you know, $15,000 or $25,000 a day to act in those days, which, you know, $75,000 or $100,000 today. Yet he rarely ever had money in his pocket. He just kind of was not good with money. So what he would do was he broke the cardinal rule of Hollywood, which is he put his own money into his own films, right? You know, the whole thing about other people's money. Wells was the opposite. He was, you know, not a businessman and really hadn't had a great producer at his side since Citizen Kane, when John Houseman was still working with him. So in '70, he comes back. He starts filming in a home that he's renting in Beverly Hills. And he shoots for about 6 months. And then everybody comes to work one day, and Wells is gone. And he comes back 6 months later, because he's gone off to Europe to film a couple of movies, and he's ready to shoot again. And this is how the process of the shooting, you know, to a large extent went. It was kind of 6 months on, 6 months off. He had a very loyal crew of young people who came from kind of the non-union. It was very hard to break into Hollywood as a crew person. So he had a cinematographer named Gary Graver, who had worked on Roger Corman films and movies. You know, it's kind of incredible to think about, but you know, Orson's cinematographer was a guy who had been making movies called like Satan's Sadists and things like that, and biker films and kind of, you know, just kind of, you know, borderline fringy movies, but who really had learned how to make films quickly and effectively and on a budget. And so Gary brought along a bunch of people from this world, from this Roger Corman non-union world with him, and they were super loyal to Orson because this is Orson Welles. And they're people who really appreciate that they are working for Orson Welles and are happy to be going to work for Orson Welles every day. And he's magnetic. So he has this loyal crew, and so he shoots, the film was shot between 1970 and 1976. His cast initially, which I found one of the things I found fascinating from the start, was that he was casting people kind of from his own life. I mean, the film, I should explain, is about a director who comes back to Hollywood to make a big comeback film, who is an older director who's fallen out of favor with the studios.
Not at all biographical.
Not at all biographical. Though he always claimed, you know, no, it's not about me. And the first day of shooting, he has two guys playing the main character's biographers. One is Joseph McBride, who is writing a biography of Welles at the time. And the other is Peter Bogdanovich, who is not yet a famous filmmaker, but is a film writer who is writing an as told to or kind of interview book with Welles. So essentially two of his biographers are playing the main character's biographers. And this is the way the production of the film goes. I always thought the most telling and fascinating thing about the film was that Bogdanovich in 1970 is playing essentially Bogdanovich in 1970, playing out his relationship with Welles. In 1974, one of the characters is a extremely successful young director who has made 3 hit films that are critical hits and giant box office sensations as his first 3 films, which is exactly what Bogdanovich has done. And he, the main character, this director who winds up being played by John Huston, is his mentor, much as Welles had been Bogdanovich's mentor. And Welles had hired Rich Little, who was a comedic impressionist who was on TV all the time doing Nixon and Jimmy Stewart and Jimmy Cagney and all those typical, kind of celebrity impressions. He had hired him to play this character, primarily, I think, because Peter Bogdanovich himself, once he got famous, liked to go do celebrity impressions on talk shows. Rich Little wound up leaving the shoot before he finished. And Welles was in trouble, and he called Bogdanovich and said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And Bogdanovich said, well, why don't I play the part? And Welles said, well, you're already in the movie. And he said, oh, you can reshoot that stuff. I'll just do this. So Bogdanovich shows up, and for the next month or so, shoots this new role. So Peter Bogdanovich literally goes from playing himself in 1970 to playing himself in 1974. 2 completely different phases of his life. And that, to me, I always found that fascinating. I think Welles really, at this point in his life, everything he shot in the film was a blur of fact and fiction. He was shooting in homes that he was renting. He was writing and editing and shooting at the same time, all the time. So for 6 years, this process of making this film is this on and off, going to get money to make the film, loyal crew, always coming back whenever he calls, and then he's doing everything at the same time. So it's kind of the art and life converging upon themselves. And so he wound up ultimately getting money from his primary source of funds, other than himself, was a guy named Mehdi Boucherie, who was the Shah of Iran's brother-in-law, which is just as a side note, that's how kind of wild the making of this film was, that was his producer, who's always gotten a bad rap, because he's the Shah's brother-in-law, but he was this incredibly cultured guy who really admired Welles and really cared about the film, and in many ways has been portrayed as a villain, and ultimately, I think, was somebody who really went a million miles of additional length to support Welles making the film.
At that point, he loses I think it's like 1976. He loses the rights to the film because of the Iran hostage crisis.
Yeah, well, what happened was there were a couple things. Welles was really not. As I said before, he was not good with money, and as best I could tell, Welles, he was not a profligate spender necessarily, but he was not somebody who kept track of things financially. And he didn't, the art side came first, always for him. And he had a life where he had been very much removed from, I think, financial realities. He kind of had people around him who helped him to varying degrees with money, and I'm not sure he always knew what everything cost. And he was, saving money on gaffer's tape. He would have them reuse gaffer's tape, but he was smoking a case of $25 cigars every day. So, it was a little out of whack. He was not thinking in financial terms. And he kept needing more and more money for the film. And one thing that happened was one of the producers who was involved, who was not with the Iranians, allegedly had stolen some of the money. But additionally, the Iranians kept giving him more and more money, to the point where they owned more and more of the film. And Welles had a 50% share that slowly was a 40% share, a 30% share, a 20% share. And then there would be disputes in which they would restore his share of the film to 50%. So there were at least a couple of occasions where his share dwindled down to very little financially, and they would restore it in order to help him remain inspired to finish the film. Then in 78, 79, things started to get really bad in Iran. And Boucherie, the producer, kind of foresaw this and tried to sell his rights to the film to a Canadian group that were really just like, let's help Orson Welles finish this film. He was never, it's funny, he never had a shortage of people who believed, like, Orson Welles, we've got to help him. And, but Welles, for reasons I'm not sure are clear, walked away from that, and then the Iranian Revolution happened, and the Shah was overthrown, and all of a sudden, this film winds up essentially, I guess, owned by the nation, the state of Iran, under Ayatollah Khomeini, but it's in France because the Iranian production company was in France. Which, I mean, and this is where, not that this is where the story gets really crazy, because the story is, crazy enough to start with. But what happened was, France has this kind of arcane law under which the creator of a work of art owns inherent moral rights to the work of art. So the Iranians essentially have financial ownership of the picture, but they can't do anything without Welles, because Welles has this moral ownership of the picture. And that's where things get locked down. Welles wants to, tries to buy the picture from them, but can't get the funds. They would, attempt to get Welles to, work with them. He won't work with them because they're the bad guys. And there are just all these crazy stories. I know at one point, some of the Ayatollah's people showed up at the production office in Paris to try to find out what was going on. And they were producing some other films. And the woman who was running the company at the time had a tax bill from the French government that had been written incorrectly, and instead of 30,000 francs, it was written as 3 million francs, and it just happened to be sitting on her desk. And they came in and they said, we want to know about what you have, what's going on. She said, sure, but we owe 3 million francs to the French government, and I guess this is really yours. And they were like, no thanks, we're not interested in movies anymore. So just all this craziness happened, but the film, ultimately, nobody could agree on anything. Orson passed away in '85. He left the rights to his unfinished films to his mistress, Oya Kodar, who had been involved in the film. He had an estate that passed to his widow, and then she passed away very quickly, so it wound up in his daughter Beatrice's hands. So Beatrice was the heir to his estate, and then you had the Iranians. So you had these three parties. You have the mistress, the daughter, and the Iranian, owners of the film, and to get them to agree, to get all three parties to agree to anything was nearly an impossible task for 30 years after he passed away.
And then that just and then skipping ahead, it just sat in the vault for all that time, and then they in the last few years, they finally managed to get the circumstances to work out to the point where they could get financing from Netflix. And
yeah, I mean, it took on Philip, the producer's part, diplomacy that I can't even begin to fathom to make this happen. I mean, it was not an easy group of people. It was not an easy financial situation, and it was, over the years, one of the things I had tracked were the numerous efforts to get the film completed. And just writing about that, I mean, when I was writing about that, I just remember how frustrated I'd be at the end of the day writing about what people had done. And so to get it done was really remarkable. And Philip really did all the diplomacy, and then Netflix came in with the funding, and that, was the final thing that made it happen. And even then, there were still complications. Even once the vault was opened, and they said, "Okay, we'll pay whatever it takes to get this film finished," it was not an easy process. But they got it done, and it's really about as close to a miracle as you're going to find.
Creating a film is always a massive undertaking. Now that we have a sense of the insane production cycle that Orson Welles had to go through to produce the film to begin with, what does The Other Side of the Wind even mean as a film? All of Welles's films have meaning, be they deconstructions of Shakespeare, political satires, or tragic downfalls. But this film seems to represent the final years of his career. It was made on a shoestring budget, shot across multiple different formats of film, and then put together in post by dozens of people over the course of decades. In all that, what kind of depths can we mine to understand the life of Orson Welles? To understand this, I knew exactly who to turn to.
Okay, I'm Jonathon Rosenbaum. I used to be a film critic for the Chicago Reader until 2008. Since then, I've been, although officially retired, unofficially, I'm still a freelance writer and teacher.
As I'm aware, you've served as a consultant for Other Side of the Wind?
Yes, and I've also written an essay about this film, The Other Side of the Wind, that'll be appearing in a book of mine that's coming out in the spring called Cinematic Encounters 2, Portraits and Polemics. I have an interview coming out in an earlier book that's coming out actually just within a few days called Cinematic Encounters, Interviews and Dialogues. That I have an interview that I had in the early 70s with Welles.
All right. I want to talk about where this film is coming from artistically from Orson. So Orson Welles returns to the United States in 1970, and this is his big return to Hollywood feature. I get the sense, or what was the significance given that where he was coming from at this time in his life?
Well, first of all, I don't see this as a return to Hollywood. It's a film about Hollywood, but it's anything but a Hollywood film. And I question whether any of Welles' films really qualify as Hollywood films. They're films of an independent filmmaker who sometimes use the facilities of Hollywood in terms of its studios, but I actually think, and I don't know if you really can say that he was returning to, I mean, he went back and forth from Europe to America quite a lot, and it wasn't like he sort of lived only in Europe, and he moved back and forth a lot, so I don't see this as a particular return to Hollywood. It's just like some of his work took him to Los Angeles, some of his work took him elsewhere.
In our correspondence, we were talking about the improvisation of Other Side of the Wind and how you don't agree that the film was improvised, as opposed to what a lot of people have said in regards to how the film was planned out and structured and written.
Well, I think in the sense that it was the scenes at the party were pretty much, except for with a few exceptions, were scripted in advance, and part of my work as consultant, I mean, it involved different aspects, but part of it was going over all of the different scripts he wrote before production. The film within the film was actually written out much more sketchily, and that was basically, Welles did say that he was a director as someone who presides over accidents, which means that sometimes unforeseeable things happen. And so there were certain things that you could say were improvisation in terms of the conditions of the shooting. But most of the dialogue at the party, with the exception of, for example, the conversation between Paul Mazursky and Henry Jaglom, was not scripted, and there were a few things like that, but most of the dialogue and the things said by all the major characters were scripted, and they pretty much exist in the film now as they were in the original script, which he wrote before anything was shot.
Sure. Obviously, we talked about how the impression tends to be that the film was improvised, but that's not the case. So.
Well, right. I think that it's unfortunate that you have in the Morgan Neville documentary someone who say there was no script. I mean, there was a script, but that doesn't mean that the person who said that saw the script, you know. Wells didn't feel it was necessary for everyone who worked on the film to have a copy of the script. But the film was, at least the scenes at the ranch and the party were pretty much, by and large, scripted.
I guess that falls more into the mystique area of Orson Welles, where you never knew like what he was telling everyone, because you know what I mean.
Yes, that's right, and I think it's. But I think part of the problem that I think that exists in a lot of the discourse about Welles is that basically in most of the world, Orson Welles is seen and viewed as a successful artist. In America, he's regarded as a bad business investment. So when they sort of talk about, you know, and that's where the idea even of Hollywood comes in, that, you know, it's sort of like they see him in America as a failed Hollywood director, but in fact, I think one could look at him as a successful independent filmmaker who wasn't always able to bring all of his projects to completion the way he wanted to, because he was very bad at handling money and doing business and things of this kind. But he basically was not someone who basically worked well with, you know, within a studio context. And even though, for example, even when he used the backlot of MGM for some of the sequences on the other side of the wind, this was done secretly and unofficially, and where they basically had to, and there they had to improvise because they only had about like a day and a half to shoot whatever they could. And so they had to scramble around finding what they did, you know, and shooting accordingly. But by and large, he was not, if anything, it seems to me that The Other Side of the Wind is very clearly an anti-Hollywood film, not a Hollywood film, and was never conceived of as a Hollywood film.
I'm curious how this film fits in with the other later period films he shot, like F for Fake, which he...
Well, yes, I think, and one thing is, it's very important to emphasize that The Other Side of the Wind is not his last film. F for Fake was done after most of, you know, The Other Side of the Wind had already been shot. And one thing it has in common with F for Fake, though, is that there were two of his late films that were completed that were co-written by Oya Kodar. In both cases, the films were based on stories by Welles and a particular story by Oya. And she gave the title to both films. And it seems to me that in both F for Fake and in The Other Side of the Wind, you have a kind of contrast between the input of each of them, you know, where with Welles you have, I mean, I've described both Oya and Welles as being reclusive exhibitionists, or exhibitionistic, you know, recluses. And I think that applies to both of these films, because you have Oya being very exhibitionistic and showing off how beautiful and sexy she was and all of this, and Welles showing off his, let's say, his verbal dexterity, you know, in terms of witty dialogue and things of this kind. So they're both, in both cases, you know, different forms of exhibitionism that each of them contributed. And in terms of my role as a consultant, because I've been friends with Oya for over 30 years now, I felt that my role was to represent her point of view as well as I understood it. And that's applied to both, you know, all my conversations with her over the years, and even more, the most detailed conversations we had about it were just last July, after I had seen the film, As of now, which is in November, she still hasn't seen the final version of the film, although she did get to see, you know, 2 of the rough cuts, actually. And gave her own input in addition to, you know, like, I mean, and I was basically sent a copy of or given a copy of the rough cut, and also flown to LA to look at that, you know, rough cut, and spent a whole day talking with, you know, Philip Riesma and Joe McBride and the editor, Bob, you know. So basically, my input consisted of, you know, like the whole day I spent in Los Angeles talking about the rough cut, and then writing a very lengthy, you know, sort of like memo or letter, notes, you know, given my responses to the rough cut.
Given that, you think the film is relatively close to Orson and Oya's vision?
Well, I think one of the things that's complicated about when you talk about vision is that Wells' vision changed several times a day. No, but I mean, I think that that's the way artists work. I mean, certainly that's the way he worked as an artist, and I think it's probably the way Oya as an artist works. So that you can't really, that's one of the things that separates it, because the model of Hollywood filmmaking is that you have a very precise idea of what you want, and it's all scripted and planned in advance and storyboarded, and then, you know, you edit according to that plan. But Wells was someone who revised his, you know, based on all sorts of things, including changing attitudes towards the material, discoveries he made during the editing, and so on. I do think it's significant that he spent more time editing the film within the film than he spent, you know, editing on the party scenes. And it's also important to point out, I think, that, what was I going to say? I'm sorry, I've kind of lost the thread.
It's okay.
I think he basically, one of the things that was very important to him and also to Oya, and which was one of the main points of, let's say, the point of view I represented, was that the scenes at the party and the film within the film should be given equal prominence, that they were equally important. I mean, that's not a battle that we won in totally, because there's more of the party scenes than there is of the film within the film. But ideally, the subtitle of my essay about the film, which will be coming out in the spring, is, you know, Orson Welles, you know, or its first impressions of Orson Welles' demonic fugue. And I see it as a fugue in which you have 2 very different kinds of material which are shown in alternation, and without either one being privileged over the other. That was in terms of the original conception. And I would say that one of the ways in which I differ with, let's say, some of the final editing decisions that were made on the film is that because it wasn't a Hollywood film, but on the other hand, it was edited by a committee, and all but one of the members of the editing team were Hollywood people. So they thought in terms of the sound editing, for example, in terms of, you know, wanting to, you know, the usual, following the kinds of codes of sound and image that, you know, in terms of continuity, all of this, that Hollywood directors would follow. But I think that was, in some cases, works against the grain of what I think Wells was after. And I think, for example, there's much too much music, I think, used in the film as it is now, that Wells would not have. And of course, Wells had the benefit of being, when he worked with Michel Legrand for Fake, of supervising and guiding and telling him where he wanted music and where he didn't want music, where he never had an opportunity to do that with Legrand for The Other Side of the Wind. So consequently, I think that the use of the music sometimes is harmful, because I think it actually interferes with what the film is doing dramatically. Particularly where I argued and lost the battle was in the scene involving the school teacher and Hannaford, when there's the gay baiting that goes on. I originally saw that sequence when Oya showed it at the very first academic Wells conference at NYU many, many years ago, the first time I ever saw that sequence. And there was no music then, and it was much more powerful and confrontational than it is now because of the piano music in the background.
Essentially, a more true cut would have been a lot sparser and a lot more raw, I guess.
I think so, but that's just a guess because I mean I think Welles, as I say, changed his mind all the time, and I have no way of, sort of like saying what direction he would have taken it into, given what he had in terms of what his own choices were and so on. So I can't say that, but all I can say is that having seen that particular sequence with and without the music, it was much more powerful when there wasn't any music.
Okay. I definitely got the sense when I saw the film that this was more so people's interpretation of the film, especially with the Bogdanovich opening, which is obviously supposed to be Welles, but having him change the lines and reframe.
No, well, I thought that was a perfectly understandable and reasonable, because even the wording is largely, although he added some stuff in order to update it and so on, that seems to me all of that was perfectly legitimate. And I have to also say that I think most of the work done by the people who did the work on the film was really first rate. And, and I basically applaud and think that especially the editing done by Bob, I think was, in terms of trying to match the editing style, was very successful. I would have preferred that the film within the film, that those sequences were a bit longer, even though they wouldn't have, if that had been done, it would have been even still less of a Hollywood film than it is now. But I do think it qualifies as Welles' most experimental film.
Yeah.
And I think it's, and his most radical in that sense.
Sure.
And by the same token, his most difficult. I think we're still a long way from really being able to come to terms with everything the film does, but I think that's nothing new with Welles. I think first impressions with Welles films have almost never been, the ones we have now. If you look back at the original reviews of Touch of Evil, for example, when they said, well, it's pretty good, but it's not Citizen Kane. And of course, when F for Fake came out, they said, well, it's very amusing, but it's not Touch of Evil. It's like they're always sort of like trying to weigh it based on the previous films, where Welles, what particularly made Welles unbankable was the fact that he never did the same thing twice, nor did he ever want to do the same thing twice. Unlike somebody like Woody Allen, where if you look at a Woody Allen film, even when the credits come on, it's a Woody Allen film. But you don't know what an Orson Welles film is, nor did he. And I think that's what made him a bad business investment.
So Peter Bogdanovich has talked about the fact that Welles had a preference for shooting in black and white, and you were talking about the importance of the film within a film.
Yes.
And that film is shot in Technicolor, as opposed to the rest
and
of the film.
And in 35 mil.
Yeah. As opposed to the rest of the film, which is
well, what he liked about black and white was that he thought it was much better for performances. That he actually thought that when you shot certain, things in color, that the performances were not often as strong. But even though he did shoot in color, for example, when he made Immortal Story, for example, and of course lots of F for Fake is shot in color. The most of F for Fake, in fact. So I think one of the more ambiguous things that I think a lot of people are still trying to come to terms with is to what extent he wanted the film within the film to be, like a bad film, or whether he wanted it to be a good film. And I think that's something I think he actually changed his mind about all the time. Because I think there are sequences in the film within the film that are stronger than anything even at the party in terms of the editing, like the sex scene in the car, which was originally, I believe, 2.5 minutes longer in Welles' edit. His own editing, which he edited about approximately 1/3 of the film as we have now, and about roughly 40 minutes, I think. And I think that, and then there were certain cases where his own editing decisions were not always honored. They usually were. But for example, in his edit, there were no cuts to Hannaford in black and white looking, that's something that was added by the people who worked on it recently. It was not part of Welles' original editing. But I think that obviously what's going on in the film within the film is not acting in the usual sense, and there's no dialogue at all. Part of what makes it so interesting as a fugue, or if you see it in that way, is that it's the exact opposite of what's going on there. I mean, everything at the party is nothing but talk. It's a lot of individuals talking. You see almost literally no couples at all at the party, which I think is very significant. There's only 1 or 2 shots in the film that actually show couples. And I think I would guess, and again, if it was true of my sense of Welles' conception, even those 2 shots would not be in the film, because I think that the whole emphasis, obviously, on the film within the film is that it's a couple, even though it's a couple that's constantly in tension, and it's not, in other words, it's not a happy couple, exactly. But even the coupling is sort of contentious in a way. But I think that that's part of what, and of course what happens at the party is contentious also. But I do think that there's a lot of, a real dialectic between these 2 types of material. Even though you get, in fact, one of the moments that I really love in the film is when you get kind of like rhyme effects between the 2 kinds of material. Like when you get a kind of beautiful audiovisual, voluptuous kind of rhyme effect between Hannaford pouring liquor into his glass in close-up, and the sounds of rain against the windows in the car scene when they're having sex. That's an example of a kind of rhyme effect between the 2 kinds of material. And I think Welles, who saw editing in musical terms, would have been thinking very much about, those types of play between the 2 kinds of material.
I want to talk more about Jack Hannaford. So,
yes,
obviously, one of the big questions about the film circling it is the degree to which the film is autobiographical.
Well, I think Welles is obviously playing with that quite a bit. There's a lot that's in the film that obviously makes you think, oh, this is like Welles. I mean, all kinds of things, not just Bogdanovich and Joseph McBride, who were very, very much associated with, Welles, but also, the school teacher who was like Roger Hill in certain respects. But there are other ways in which he's not at all like, he certainly was not, Welles was interested in bullfighting like Hannaford, but he was not a big game hunter, for example. He would have been appalled by, He also was, you could say in some ways misogynistic and a sexist, but not in the same way as Hannaford. So I think one of the things we have to consider, and this plays a very big role, is that no matter how critical people were of Welles when he was alive, no one was ever as critical of him as he was of himself.
Yeah.
And I think there's an awful lot of auto-criticism and even self-hatred that's worked into this film, to the extent that it becomes, in some ways, it's a very bitter film. And I think part of the problems that people have in relating to it is that Jake Hannaford is a rather odious character. A very unlikable figure. Of course, that's also true of Hank Quinlan in Touch of Evil. But in some ways, Hannaford may be even more unlikable than Hank Quinlan. But he's also charismatic, as was Hank Quinlan, too. So it becomes very complicated. I think if Welles had played the role himself, I think he was right in saying that he wouldn't have been as good as Huston was. So I think that Welles was correct in saying that, that he would have been the second choice, to play the role, but it would have complicated our responses much more. Because I think the part of the idea of what Welles wants to do with the film is for it to be about him and not about him, both. I think he wants there to be an uncertainty about that. And I think that because he's playing with all the mythology around himself as a character, but he's also putting in enough material to make it different. Because, when a lot of people say, okay, they say that the film within the film was about his, a parody of Antonioni. For people who know Antonioni's work, it isn't really that, except about subject matter, It's not, it has almost none of Antonioni's style. But that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of the film within the film is the work of Oya, not just the work of Welles. And Oya is someone who is not a film buff and is not very familiar at all with Antonioni. Now, Oya told me, and there's some people, like Joe McBride, who question this, that she directed 3 sequences in the film within the film. And this is not something she was eager to tell me. On the contrary, I've known her for 30 years, and at one point when I saw a very early rough cut, several years ago, I thought that the final sequence in the film within the film, with the enormous penis that sort of falls down, that was directed by her. And I said, is that true? And she said, yes, you're right. But last July, after I saw the film and talked with her about it in great detail, and I managed to coax out of her that she, at least according to her, directed 2 other sequences. And what for her was directing, I mean, it might not be the same definition we would give, which was the sex scene in the car and the scene in the ladies' room at the disco. In the case of the the ladies' room at the disco, Welles was sick when they did a lot of the first shooting. And so she had to go and do it because he was ill at the time. But one thing I think is clear in all of this is at no point was she trying to say, even though she, Welles wanted her to have the credit of co-writer, that this was a Orson Welles Oya Kodar film, or, directed by the 2 of them. No, she sees, I think all that she saw her role is basically doing what he wanted her to do, and which sometimes was giving her creative input in terms of the film within the film, that she might have helped design some of the scenes because she's a sculptor and she is an artist. But I don't think he wanted, and the same thing I think existed in F for Fake also, that the whole episode of involving Picasso in F for Fake was based on a story she wrote before she even met Welles, which the first time they had lunch together, she showed him her story. And she said that he told her at the time that he liked her story a lot, but he thought, well, that's because, he's attracted to me sexually and wants to make, But later the fact he remembered it and wanted to use it in F for Fake, and then she realized that he actually liked the story. And in terms of how much, she actually contributed as a writer, I don't know, but what she specifically says is the idea of Hannaford sleeping with his leading ladies because they had slept with his leading men, that was based on a story and an idea of hers. And that was her contribution. But when we get to other sort of things that are autobiographical, I mean, it seems to me that, for example, Julie Rich, everybody says as Pauline Kael. Well, she's also Barbara Leeming, because Barbara Leeming was, even though she wasn't the official biographer, she was much younger than Pauline Kael and more attractive also, Barbara Leeming. So Susan Strasberg looks more like Barbara Leeming than it looks like Pauline Kael. You also find out that she has, her real name was Polish and that she had a leftist background, and none of that corresponds to, as far as I know, to either Barbara Leeming or to Pauline Kael. So it seems to me that Welles was very deliberately throwing a monkey wrench into simple, X equals Y, in other words, simply saying, this is autobiography, even when you come to sort of like when it says so-and-so equals Robert Evans, as the producer, it seems to me that these people are designed to provoke associations, but we're not supposed to read it as like a, roman à clef, that everything is sort of equal to a real person. It seems to me what he's playing is a much more complicated game than that.
Sure. So I'm aware, Welles had a disdain for auteur theory.
Well, he basically thought that, yes, I mean, he thought that directors were overrated and that actors were underrated in terms of how important they were. But at the same time, I mean, I think Welles believed in himself, you know, as an auteur in a certain way. He did feel, and in directors he admired, like Renoir and Ford and people like this. So he was much more opposed to the idea of cinephiles, which is, by the way, is the correct word, not cinéaste, which in French means usually filmmaker, not film lover. I think he basically didn't like the idea of people who knew, you know, cinephiles who only knew about film and didn't know about other things. That he thought basically to be a good filmmaker you had to know about the world and you had to know about the other arts and you had to know, you know. So I think that, but I don't think it would be correct to say that he was simply, even though he obviously spends a lot of time, and this is Orson Welles, which I edited, you know, in fact, Oya hired me to edit that book. I don't think it would be simply, you know, correct to simply say that he was opposed to auteur theory. I think it was more accurate to say that he thought directors were overrated and actors were underrated as creative forces in filmmaking.
How much do you see of that in Other Side of the Wind?
I think that obviously the role of acting is very important in the party scenes. It seems to me that, for example, one of the things that a lot of people bring away from the film is their feelings about a character like played by Norman Foster, you know, Billy, who's sort of like this gopher who gets treated horribly and driven back to drink by Hanford and all of this. And that's a very powerful performance. And actually, Huston has never given a better performance than he gives in this film. I don't think Peter Bogdanovich has ever given a better performance than he gives in this film. So I think the performances are very important. Which is not to say that it isn't a film by Orson Welles. It is a film by Orson Welles. Even though it's not, every decision was not his to make. The same thing is true of Mr. Arkadin. In other words, I think you could say that arguably The Other Side of the Wind may have been as close to being a Welles film as Mr. Arkadin is to being a Welles film. You know, or other films in which he didn't have, you know, and an awful lot of things were cut out of Lady from Shanghai, too, that he wanted in the film. And even The Stranger, when he was trying to be, you know, to adhere to and to make a Hollywood film. That's the one film of his that I think deserves and should be called a Hollywood film in every respect. Even there, the first 2 reels were cut out, you know, that he shot. So it's, so the point is that many of his films did not come out exactly the way he wanted, but that doesn't mean that they aren't Orson Welles films. They still are. And The Other Side of the Wind, I think, deserves to be called that also.
Sure. So this will be my last question. You talk about in your essay for F or Fake on the Criterion Collection about your experience meeting Welles in France.
Yes.
What would you want people to take away from your experience meeting him, aside from his occasionally megalomaniacal personality that he seems to?
Well, he wasn't. Well, I mean, basically before I met him, I used to think if there was anybody in the world I most wanted to be, it would be Orson Welles. After I had my 1-hour lunch with him, I didn't feel that way anymore. I felt it was hard to be Orson Welles. I also felt the main impression I took away from our lunch was that he was very self-absorbed, but also very much aware that he was self-absorbed, and went to great lengths to compensate for it by being incredibly nice. He wasn't putting on a show to me. I think he was being very honest with me. And it was, you know, I actually met him because he invited me to lunch. All I did was write him a letter asking him some questions about Heart of Darkness, his first film project. And 2 days later, he invited me to have lunch with him, at that time, I'd written practically nothing. Although I did mention in my letter that I had written an attack on Raising Cain of Pauline Kael, so that might have helped him. But he never mentioned that when he, you know, and he arrived 5 minutes or 10 minutes late to our lunch and apologized for being late. He would pour my wine, ask if I was enjoying the meal. He was great. in a lot of ways. But at one point, for example, when I thought he might be interested in the fact that my family had been small-town movie theater exhibitors, he wasn't in the least bit interested. And he didn't want to, and he didn't make any bones about changing the subject, you know. So, I mean, I thought on the whole he was really a great person. But I didn't want to be him as I had felt, you know, or had fantasized about him before meeting him. And I didn't feel that he was putting on a show, you know, and I didn't feel he was playing the role of Orson Welles with me, which I appreciated, actually.
That, we come to the end of this retrospective. Orson Welles was a very great man and a very critical man who had many different sides to his personality, as all great men do. He was an artist above all things, a worldly man who traveled the world, understood different cultures, and was able to learn and love different people. Other Side of the Wind was the culmination of all that. And not his last film, technically speaking, as he did do other films that would be released prior to his death, but definitely the one that most encapsulates the final years of his life. With that, I'm Tyler with the Fox Valley Film Critics. Have a wonderful day.